You work with a lot of founders, CEOs, tons of your friends will be in that position too. What do you make of the response to the Brian Thompson killing and the situation more broadly?
Well, the killing itself was obviously an enormous shock, and I know people who knew him and had been with him recently. So he was a well known figure in the healthcare industry. So very respected among in the sort of the business circles. Enormous shock, and then of course at first you're just like, well, these things are either random or or most murders are committed by somebody in somebody's personal life. The way this one seems to be unfolding, is, and I don't know anything that's not in the press, but it seems to have a ideological motivation behind it, and so, and then it's like, okay, is that just a one-off, or, is this the beginning of a pattern? I would say it a lot of people I talk to are very disconcerted by, I would say, the enthusiasm that a lot of people in the press are showing to. Yeah, there have been a shockingly large number of stories of the line of, of course, murder is bad, but
we shouldn't laugh. I shouldn't laugh.
Right. Well, it is. You have to laugh or you cry, right? So, and then it's like 3,000 words that come after the but, right? And it's like, well, okay, which is basically a long-winded, sort of justification for murder. And so, that is disconcerting. There are some comedians now, that have gotten in the game. I would say this is fairly disconcerting. We'll see what happens. The scary scenario, I mentioned the 70s. Domestic terror actually got to be quite a thing in the 70s in the U.S. And there's this great book called Days of Rage that kind of chronicles basically this like very widespread pattern of domestic terror, ideologically motivated domestic terror in the 70s. By many kind of sort of radical revolutionary groups, the Weather Underground and many others, what a lot of those domestic terrorists had in common was sort of this very kind of privileged backgrounds. A lot of these were like Ivy League, like the Weather Underground came out of Columbia University, and then domestic terrorists coming out of places like UC Berkeley, and then sort of often very privileged backgrounds, very kind of upper kind of elite upper middle class people. And then, ended up in some cases going on the lam for years, being hunted by the FBI. And there were years in the 1970s when there were thousands of terror bombings a year. And then there was a run of, anti-corporate, basically murder and terrorism in Germany, kind of through that period into the 80s, with this thing called the Baader-Meinhof group and so forth. And so, there's always been this kind of violent edge to kind of call it the anti-corporate, anti-business, anti-industrial, kind of. By the way, a little bit of that, some of that's on the left, some of that's on the right. There's different, you can squint different ways. Ted Kaczynski was on the right. This guy maybe appears to be a little bit more on the left. And so, this pattern has unfolded before. I don't know that it's ever been effective at causing any of the change that its proponents seem to want. It seems to, these tactics, violent tactics usually backfire in our societies. But certainly hope that this doesn't become a copycat situation. And I do think it's striking. I think there are a lot of voices in American public life who are behaving quite irresponsibly right now.
What do they think that they're doing? That sometimes people that run healthcare organizations don't pay out when people should be paid out. Therefore, it's okay to kill the person at the top.
Yeah, it's the thing. Well, it's of course murder is bad, but, and then in the 3,000 words is basically what you said. So the whole healthcare situation is it's obviously very complicated and very emotional. And this can become a very long conversation, but the sort of key fact that all Western countries are trying to kind of grapple with, and this is true of the US, but also Canada and the UK and the rest of Europe. Basically, there's two key facts. So key fact number one is healthcare is at like a fifth of US GDP in terms of spending. So like a fifth of all national production per year goes to healthcare. And that number is rising. The healthcare is basically rising. And if you just chart this on a graph, it's just very clear what's happening is healthcare left unchecked is going to go from being a fifth of the economy to a fourth to a third to a half. And then, someday in the future, effectively all of it. And then nobody wants to pay for it, right? Right. And so like nobody wants to pay, everybody wants somebody else to pay for it. And then just saying the government should pay for it, of course, doesn't answer the question because the government has to be funded by somebody. And so that means taxpayers have to pay for it. And so you get in all these questions. And of course, we live in a progressive taxation system in which, people who make more money pay a higher percentage of taxes. And, there's big political fights over that. And I'm kind of neutral on that. I don't really care. It's not one of my issues. But it's part of this big fight over who pays for it. So that's That's issue number one, and that's just going to, it's going to bring out a lot of emotion in people because, of course, especially as you get closer to end of life or you get into these, very bad chronic, conditions that require a lot of money to take care of people. It's this real challenge of how to pay for it. And then the other kind of key kind of fact is all these countries also are aging very rapidly. Right, the demographics are headed in the direction of increased average age, and the consequence of that is a sharp reduction in the percentage of working age people versus older people, retirees, and the whole basis for every social welfare system in the world is that the current workers pay for the current retirees. Right, that is the basis. There is no the Social Security Trust Fund doesn't exist. The money that you pay in, you don't get later. Your money you pay in today gets paid out to old people today. And then when you're old, there need to be young workers in the system to be able to generate the money to pay you. And that's true for Social Security. It's true for Medicare. It's true for Medicaid. It's true for all of these it's true of any socialized health system. It'd be true of government funded health system. It'd be the same thing. It's just, for taxpayers. Taxpayers are people who work. And so if the demographics go upside down and you have a country, and you can see the future in places like Japan where you just have like way more old people than you have young people. And then you just have this like fundamental mismatch, and then you literally quite simply can't pay for it. And so like these two things kind of put this whole issue in a vice. Now, what we try to do, like in our line of work, which is, tech and biotech and VC, what we try to do is figure out ways to kind of get out of that vice, primarily through new technologies that at least, in some cases will provide new kinds of healthcare, new kinds of drugs and new kinds of medical devices, but also things that are able to break that price curve and able to make healthcare much cheaper, right? That's the other way to solve it is you make all this stuff much cheaper. And that's where, we get excited about things like, for example, AI in healthcare, right? And, maybe the prospect that instead of, people having, only having human doctors, maybe a lot of, routine medical interactions are with AI doctors. And then, you only consult with a human doctor when something gets, really sensitive. And, I think there's a reasonable chance in the next few years that we can figure out how to do that. So hopefully we can solve this with technology. It is weird, I will say, and it's coming out in this kind of current, kind of debate and controversy. It is weird that the same people who are the maddest about healthcare costs rising and not being able to pay for it are also the ones who hate technology the most. Right? Like,
yeah,
people who care most about climate, the people who care most about climate and carbon emissions hate nuclear energy the most, right? And it's like, all right, we are genuinely trying to help solve these. Those of us in tech are genuinely trying to help solve these problems.
What do you think that is? Is it just some sort of generalized skepticism, generalized scrutiny over rich people that they don't have the best interests at heart of the common folk?
Yeah, well, there's these part of it's just like simply moral intuitions, right? And so you have these kind of moral intuitions and moral intuitions presumably evolved to be the way they are according to kind of historical conditions of how people lived. But historically, people lived in these very small, kind of communities. One way of describing, there's this great book called The Ancient City that goes back and reconstructs basically like prehistoric civilization, like what it was like. And basically the conclusion of it is, sort of go back 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 years and further back, basically we all lived in these very small tribes, maxed out at a few hundred people. And then you could kind of describe the politics of the tribe being sort of a hybrid of like absolute fascism combined with absolute communism, right? Like at the same time, right? So it was like absolute fascism in that the father of the family or the leader of the tribe had the total power of life or death over all the members of the tribe and could kill them at any moment for whatever reason he wanted to. And then it was also pure communism in that there was no market economy. Everybody shared everything. And if you went out and killed an animal and brought it back and didn't share the food, they would kill it. You had to share the food. Like everything had to be shared because it was how you were. Both of those forms of governance were basically how the tribe would survive. It needed total discipline and total sharing. Right at the same time. And so we evolve these moral intuitions that basically says, maybe we don't want the fascism part, but we kind of want everything to be shared. We want everything to be equal. Having inequality is sort of intrinsically morally offensive to us. And so we naturally drive towards, and who can possibly argue against, wouldn't it be desirable if everybody had the same, how it's default unfair for some people to have more than others. And then of course, profit, particularly drives people crazy, right? Because profit in the capitalist system, if you have this moral intuition, it feels like it's unfair because it feels like it's money that's been extracted that's not doing anything. There was, I won't name names, but there was a congressman this morning who tweeted 2 back-to-back tweets. And he said, it's just completely absurd and outrageous that the American health insurance industry generates $1.4 trillion in profits per year. And he said, that's just like so clearly unfair because that's, presumptively that's $1.4 trillion being extracted, providing, no value at all. And then like 4 hours later, there was a second tweet, which he said, actually, I learned that actually it's $1.4 trillion in revenue, not profit. And total profits are, a very small fraction of what I thought it was. Right. But still, right. Equally absurd and unfair, right?
Thank you very much for tuning in. If you enjoyed that clip, you will love the full-length podcast in all its glory, which is available right here. Go on. Press it.